Alright, these are going to be the notes of our cellular respiration. First of all, we know that there's energy in a cell, and we know that most of that is housed or made, produced in the mitochondria. And the reason there's energy in a cell is because cells require energy to do work. And there's 3 different types listed here. There's physical, which is muscle contraction. There's transport work, which is the sodium-potassium pump. And then there's chemical, which is reactions that may require ATP. ATP, also known as adenosine triphosphate. Okay, cellular respiration is a series of redox reactions, or you can call them oxidative reduction reactions. And these 2 words are really confusing because reduction, you would think you're reducing, but you're actually gaining an electron or a hydrogen atom. Oxidation is the loss of electrons from the outer shell of an atom. So the way that I suggest to remember these is that this one is the opposite of what it sounds like. So instead of reducing electrons, you're gaining electrons, and then oxidation is the one that actually reduces them or loses them. And then the end result of these redox reactions is the formation of ATP. ATP production is reversible, so it should look like that. ADP plus phosphate goes back and forth with ATP. The reaction that we focus on as far as what the cell is going to break down when we're talking about all these processes is the breakdown of glucose. Obviously other things are broken down, but this is the easiest one to follow. And of course these right here should be subscript C6H12O6 plus 6 oxygen yields 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water plus ATP. Now, let's talk about this right here. When gasoline combusts in your engine in your car, it's happening very quickly, okay? The oxidation of glucose is kind of the same idea, but it's broken down into all these tiny little steps to control the release of energy so that it can be used for what the cell wants to use it for. So that's why there's all of these little steps that we 2 electron carriers that are important to know is NAD+, which when it accepts that hydrogen atom, it becomes NADH, and then FADH2 becomes, FADH becomes FADH2. There's 3 metabolic pathways that are used in breaking down glucose for energy, and you should be familiar with these from doing your posters last week, but there's glycolysis, cellular respiration, and fermentation. And depending on whether there's oxygen or not, we will either have aerobic when oxygen is present or anaerobic when oxygen is not. So when it is present, that's aerobic, and that would be glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. When there is no oxygen, that's anaerobic, and that would be glycolysis and fermentation. So instead of going here, it will go to fermentation instead. And this glycolysis happens outside the mitochondria in the site of cellular respiration, where you have the formation of acetyl-CoA, occurs in the inner membrane space of the mitochondria. The fluid-filled center of the mitochondria is called the matrix. That's where the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle takes place. We should hopefully already know the folded inner membranes called cristae is where the electron transport chain happens. Okay, when glycolysis occurs, there's a net gain of 2 ATPs because 4 ATPs are made, but 2 are used. So we end up with a net of 2 ATPs. And we also have the reduction here of NADH occurring for glycolysis. And this is just similar to what you guys had to do on your poster. It's just another way to look at it. You start with glucose, you have these enzymes occurring or working, and ATP goes to ADP, so you've taken out a phosphate, so it's added in here. And then notice this right here says isomerase, because these two are isomers, so that's the enzyme that works on it to rearrange the shape. And then here again we're losing another phosphate from ATP to ADP, so it comes here. And then these two are both formed from this. So basically when we go to this next step to show glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, there's actually going to be 2 of those for that whole rest of we used 2. So now we end up with, so right here there's 2 of these, 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 and 2 of those. So when we have this NADH here, what does that mean? Do we just have 1? No, we have 2. And when we make this ATP here, are we making 1? No, we're making 2, making 2. So this is where we had that +4 ATPs, but we used 2 early on the last slide, if you remember. Okay. This is just kind of going back to what we should have done at the beginning, but it's the definition for cellular respiration, if you want to write that down. It's the process that releases energy by breaking down glucose and other food molecules in the presence of oxygen. And we've already discussed these 2, and we already discussed that they occur in the mitochondria. And this is just another graphic to show for anaerobic you get net energy of 2 ATP for cellular respiration, and I know that many books and sources are varying on this right now. We'll just go with 36 ATP. And that's just showing you those steps there. And another. And there's the lovely citric acid cycle that I'm sure you are all so familiar with now and you love so much. It's kind of hard to see on. And here's another picture of it. We've got these NADHs being reduced. And we've got some carbon dioxide coming out, because we know when we breathe in oxygen, what do we breathe out? CO2. So that would make sense that that would be a byproduct. And here's an animation that I'll show you in class. And let's talk electron transport chain. This is where we get most of our ATP made from this whole process. So for each glucose, again, that's 36 ATP, we're just going to go with it. It says that there are 36 ATPs produced. Integral proteins called cytochromes are increasingly electronegative and pass electrons down the membrane. So basically, you've got all these electrons that have been created here, and there's these electronegative molecules, and as you go down, they get more electronegative, so those electrons are kind of passed down through. Okay. NADH and FADH bring electrons from glycolysis in the Krebs cycle to the electron transport chain. So earlier when we defined these 2, we said they were electron carriers, so they're bringing those electrons from the Krebs cycle here. As electrons are passed down, the proton gradient is established, and hydrogen ions accumulate on one side of the crystal, then fall across the membrane. The kinetic energy from this fall of ions powers ATP synthase to add a phosphate group to ADP. So there's kinetic energy from that movement of electrons or hydrogen ions, and that kinetic energy is what powers the enzyme to create ATP. And here's another picture of that. These are those cytochromes here that I was talking about that are more electronegative. And here's some movies that we'll check out in class also. And animation. Okay. In cells that can undergo respiration, the pyruvate will be completely oxidized during the citric acid cycle, leaving carbon dioxide as a waste product. All of the energy from the glucose bonds is transferred to ATP or electron carriers. So the energy is not really wasted. It's gone straight into what is necessary. The NAD plus necessary for glycolysis will be generated when NADH is oxidized by the electron transport chain. So if you remember, these were reduced in the beginning in glycolysis and Krebs cycle, and then they're oxidized here, meaning they've lost that hydrogen or the electron, and now that it's gone back to NAD plus, which can now be used at the beginning again. Okay, and then when we don't have oxygen, the cells can't respire. And so pyruvate will be reduced, not oxidized. And the fermentation will oxidize the NADH back to NAD+. Carbon dioxide and ethanol are the waste products in yeast and bacteria, and lactic acid is the waste in vertebrate muscle cells. This is why if you work out really, really hard, your muscles get very sore. You have a buildup of lactic acid because there wasn't enough oxygen getting to your muscles. And they were trying to respire, didn't have enough oxygen, so they were producing lactic acid. Fermentation releases energy from food molecules by producing ATP in the absence of oxygen. Like we just said, there's alcoholic that produces that ethanol or alcohol and CO2 and NAD+, or there's the one like in our muscles where we produce lactic acid instead of the ethanol. And a few more things there, and we're done.